Under the weight of the rope. The rope hangs against Hacksaw Ridge's limestone face like a lifeline to hell, its hemp fibers dark with moisture from the endless Okinawan rain. Private First Class. Tommy Nakamura watches it sway in the pre-dawn darkness, each movement catching what little moonlight filters through the storm clouds gathering over the Pacific. 300 feet below, the 77th Infantry Division's aid station glows dimly under canvas tarps, where medics sort through the night's casualties with the methodical efficiency of men who have learned not to count too carefully. Nakamura shifts his weight against the coral outcropping, feeling rainwater seep through his poncho. The ridge above remains silent except for the occasional crack of a sniper's rifle. But silence on Hacksaw Ridge has learned to lie. 2 hours ago, his squad received orders to prepare for withdrawal at first light. The latest assault had failed, leaving too many wounded scattered across the plateau's shell-torn surface for anyone to retrieve safely. Everyone, that is, except Desmond Doss. The combat medic sits 20 yards away, methodically checking his medical supplies by touch in the darkness. No rifle rests beside him, no ammunition clips weigh down his belt. Instead, his pack bulges with bandages, morphine syrettes and field dressings, supplies that have already saved more lives than Nakamura can count during their 3 weeks on this godforsaken ridge. The man's hands move with practiced precision, testing each tourniquet, counting sulfur packets, preparing for another journey up that rope into what every tactical manual would classify as certain death. Captain Morrison approaches through the rain, his boots squelching in the mud that never seems to dry completely in this corner of Okinawa. His face carries the weight of command decisions made in darkness, of casualty reports that reduce men to numbers, of orders from regiment that seem drafted by people who have never climbed a rope under machine gun fire. "Doss," he calls quietly, crouching beside the medic. Latest count puts 18 wounded still up there. Intel suggests the Japanese pulled back to their cave positions, but they left observers. Maybe more. Doss looks up from his pack, rainwater streaming from his helmet. His voice carries no defiance when he speaks, only the quiet certainty that has marked every conversation since they first reached this ridge 3 weeks ago. 18 men, he repeats, as if tasting the weight of the number. That's Johnson from Pittsburgh, Williams with the baby pictures, Sergeant Martinez, who shares his coffee rations. 18 names, not numbers. Nakamura watches this exchange with growing unease. He has served alongside Doss long enough to recognize the signs, the way the medic's fingers trace his rope coil, checking for weak spots, the slight forward lean of his posture, already angled toward the cliff face, the complete absence of the fear that currently makes Nakamura's stomach clench with each distant gunshot. The morning's failed assault had been a nightmare of crossfire and confusion. What intelligence described as light resistance became a killing ground when Japanese positions opened fire from concealed caves along the ridge's northern edge. Nakamura had watched good men disappear into crater holes, seen others drag themselves toward cover that proved to be illusion, heard voices calling medic from positions no sane person would attempt to reach. Yet Doss had reached them, one by one, crawling through spaces where enemy fire created deadly corridors. The unarmed medic had worked his way across the plateau's broken surface. Each rescue required a careful journey back to the rope, followed by the agonizing process of lowering wounded men down the cliff face while sniper bullets cracked through the air around him. Morrison studies the medic's face in the dim light, searching for cracks in that impossible resolve. Orders are to withdraw what's left of the company at dawn. Nobody goes back up. That includes you, Doss. The medic's hands pause in their inventory, but his voice remains steady. Reckon those orders don't apply to men who might still be breathing up there. Nakamura feels his throat tighten. During training in Georgia, he had joined others in quiet resentment of the Seventh-day Adventist, who refused to carry a weapon, who seemed to place abstract principles above practical survival. That resentment had curdled into something more complex during their first week on Hacksaw Ridge, when Doss's principles translated into a willingness to move through killing zones that armed soldiers avoided. The rope shifts in the wind, its hemp fibers creaking against the metal anchor points driven into the cliff face. Nakamura has watched that rope lower dozens of wounded men to safety, has seen it strain under impossible loads, while Doss whispered prayers above. Each journey up and down has frayed the hemp further, wearing it thin at contact points where coral rock cuts like broken glass. That rope won't hold forever, Morrison warns, though his words carry the hollow ring of a man arguing against his own conscience. You've been using it since the assault began, the weight, the friction. Doss runs the rope through his hands one more time, feeling for damaged sections. It's held this long. Reckon it'll hold long enough for 18 more. If stories like this make you imagine what you'd do under fire, tell us in the comments how you think you'd react in this situation. And stay with us for the next chapters. The rain intensifies as dawn approaches over Hacksaw Ridge, turning the coral limestone slick with moisture that makes every handhold treacherous. Nakamura watches Doss prepare for another ascent, the medic's movements precise despite hands that tremble slightly from exhaustion. 3 weeks of this routine, climbing the rope before dawn, spending daylight hours crawling between wounded men scattered across the plateau, lowering them one by one into the relative safety below, has carved lines around Doss's eyes that weren't there when the 77th Infantry Division first reached Okinawa's most contested ground. Captain Morrison stands at the cliff's edge, field glasses trained on the ridge above. The plateau stretches out in grey morning light, its surface pockmarked with shell craters that fill with rainwater and reflect the clouded sky. Broken equipment litters the landscape, helmets, rifles, medical packs abandoned during yesterday's retreat. Somewhere among that debris, 18 wounded Americans wait for help that tactical doctrine says will never come. Movement in the cave mouths, Morrison reports quietly. Could be wounded Japanese, could be observers. Intel can't tell the difference from aerial reconnaissance. Doss adjusts his pack straps, redistributing the weight of medical supplies that must last him until evening. His water situation concerns Nakamura most. The medic carries 2 canteens, but shares freely with wounded men who beg for moisture to ease their suffering. By afternoon he will be working on empty, sustained only by whatever rainwater he can collect in his helmet. Japanese positions are mostly caves carved into the coral, Doss observes, studying the ridge face above them. Wounded men lying in the open don't pose much threat to anybody. The simple logic carries weight that tactical manuals can't measure. Nakamura has watched enemy and American wounded receive equal treatment from Doss's hands, has seen the medic bandage Japanese soldiers who moments earlier were trying to kill his squad mates. Such actions violate every instinct trained into infantry soldiers, yet they seem to spring from some deeper conviction that recognizes no uniform distinctions among bleeding men. Morrison lowers his field glasses, accepting what everyone already knows. Radio contact with regiment is spotty, storms interfering with communications. If you get pinned down up there, we can't call for artillery support. Don't need artillery, Doss replies, testing the rope's tension one final time. Need steady hands and enough bandages. Nakamura remembers his first week on Hacksaw Ridge, when Doss's refusal to carry a weapon seemed like dangerous naivety. That perception had shifted during a mortar attack that left 3 men wounded in a crater hole 60 yards from safety. While others calculated angles of fire and suppression needs, Doss had simply crawled forward with his medical pack, moving through spaces where bullets cracked overhead like angry insects. The medic had spent 4 hours in that crater, working on wounds by feel, while enemy fire prevented any evacuation attempt. When darkness finally allowed the squad to reach them, they found 3 men stabilized and ready for transport, their wounds cleaned and dressed with supplies Doss had carried into what everyone else considered a death trap. Now, as morning light reveals the full scope of yesterday's casualties, Nakamura faces the growing certainty that what he initially dismissed as stubbornness might actually represent a different kind of courage entirely, one that calculates human costs differently than tactical manuals suggest. Morrison checks his watch, measuring time against orders that expect the company to be moving toward rear positions within hours. 18 confirmed wounded. That's a lot of trips up that rope. 18 trips, Doss agrees quietly. One for each man who trusted me to come back for him. The weight of that promise hangs in the humid air like the smell of cordite that never quite leaves their uniforms. Nakamura understands now why the medic's hands tremble, not from fear, but from the accumulated strain of carrying responsibility that no training manual adequately prepared him for. Each wounded soldier becomes a debt that must be paid in rope burns and exhaustion, in prayers whispered during long climbs up limestone faces, slick with rain, and something darker. Doss moves toward the rope, his approach marked by the same methodical calm that has characterized every previous ascent. Yet Nakamura notices something different this morning. A pause at the cliff's edge, a moment of hesitation that suggests even impossible faith has limits that 3 weeks of carnage have tested thoroughly. Tommy, Doss calls quietly, using Nakamura's first name for the first time since they were introduced in a staging area that now seems impossibly distant. Keep an eye on that rope. If it starts to fray through at the anchor points, you'll need to rig a new line. The instruction carries implications that make Nakamura's chest tighten. Preparing backup systems suggests Doss recognizes what everyone else has feared, that hemp fibers have breaking points measured not just in weight, but in repetitive stress applied over impossible loads, carried through conditions that would challenge equipment designed for such work. By midday, the storm over Hacksaw Ridge has settled into the steady rhythm that characterizes Okinawan weather during the spring offensive of 1945. Nakamura hunkers beneath his poncho, watching water collect in shell craters that dot the plateau above like aluminum mirrors reflecting grey sky. The rope has been in constant motion for 6 hours, carrying wounded soldiers down the cliff face with mechanical precision that belies the human cost of each rescue. Captain Morrison paces behind the aid station, radio handset pressed against his ear as he attempts to maintain contact with regimental headquarters. Static crackles through the humid air, punctuated by fragments of reports from other sectors along the Okinawan front. The news carries a familiar weight. Other units reporting similar casualties, similar impossible situations where wounded men lie beyond reasonable rescue attempts. 3rd Battalion's pulling back to secondary positions, Morrison announces after ending the radio conversation. 7th Marines are requesting additional medical support for their sector. Division wants a casualty assessment from our position within the hour. Nakamura counts the stretchers lined up beneath the medical tents, each one bearing a soldier whom Doss lowered from the ridge during the morning's efforts. 13 men so far, their wounds ranging from shrapnel cuts that require simple bandaging to complex trauma that keeps the aid station doctors working in quiet desperation. 5 more wounded still wait somewhere above, their voices occasionally drifting down through the rain when wind shifts direction properly. The mathematical progression troubles him. 13 rescued, 5 remaining, yet each subsequent trip up the rope takes longer as Doss's exhaustion accumulates and enemy awareness of his movements grows. Japanese snipers have begun targeting the cliff face specifically, their bullets chipping limestone near the rope's path in patterns that suggest deliberate harassment rather than serious interdiction attempts. Dr. Sarah Chen, the battalion's chief medical officer, emerges from the aid station wiping blood from her hands with a towel that shows the stains of too many similar cleanings. Her face carries the controlled exhaustion of someone who has learned to measure success in lives saved rather than lives lost, though Nakamura suspects the accounting grows more difficult with each passing day. "How's he managing those loads?" she asks Morrison, nodding toward the rope where Doss can be seen descending with another wounded soldier, secured to an improvised stretcher. "Some of these men weigh close to 200 pounds with full gear." Morrison watches the descent with field glasses, studying the rope's behavior under stress. He's improvising pulley systems using equipment salvaged from the plateau. Belt buckles, rifle slings, anything that reduces friction and distributes weight. The ingenuity represents more than technical skill. It demonstrates the kind of problem-solving that emerges when abstract principles meet concrete human need. Nakamura has watched Doss adapt his rescue techniques throughout their weeks on the ridge, learning to read coral formations for anchor points, discovering ways to stabilize wounded men during long descents, developing a vocabulary of knots and rigging that seems part engineering, part prayer. Dr. Chen examines the latest arrival, a sergeant with shrapnel wounds in both legs, who remains conscious enough to provide details about conditions above. His testimony matches reports from earlier rescues. Japanese positions concentrated in cave mouths along the plateau's northern edge, wounded Americans scattered in crater holes and collapsed bunkers, a landscape of broken equipment and improvised shelters where men wait for help that military doctrine suggests will never arrive. "That medic's going to kill himself trying to reach everybody," the sergeant observes weakly as Chen works on his wounds. "Saw him crawling through spaces where machine gun fire was cutting grass. No helmet, no weapon, just that medical pack and whatever faith keeps him moving." The description crystallizes something that has been building in Nakamura's mind throughout the morning's rescues. Watching Doss work has forced him to confront his own assumptions about courage, about the relationship between survival instincts and moral conviction, about what it means to serve when service requires abandoning every tactical principle designed to keep soldiers alive. Morrison checks his watch again, calculating time against orders that grow more pressing with each hour's delay. Regiment expects position reports, casualty assessments, confirmation that units are moving according to operational timelines designed by staff officers who have never climbed a rope under enemy fire. Yet the mathematics of military efficiency collide awkwardly with the reality of 5 wounded men whose lives depend on one exhausted medic's refusal to accept tactical limitations. "Weather's getting worse," Morrison notes, studying the darkening clouds that promise heavier rain by evening. "Rope's going to be slick as ice if this keeps up." Nakamura knows the captain is searching for reasonable arguments to halt Doss's rescue efforts, looking for objective factors that might override the medic's subjective determination to reach every wounded soldier. Yet each argument dissolves against the simple fact that men are still calling for help from the plateau above, their voices carrying clearly enough through the rain to make abandonment feel like chosen cruelty rather than tactical necessity. The rope jerks against its anchor points as Doss begins another ascent, his movements slower now, but still marked by the methodical precision that has characterized every previous climb. Nakamura watches hemp fibers strain under load, seeing individual strands separate where the rope passes over sharp coral edges. The deterioration progresses steadily, measurably, yet somehow the rope continues holding weights that engineering tables would classify as excessive for equipment in such condition. Would you follow the orders exactly, or trust what your own eyes and instincts tell you in a moment like this? Comment which path you'd take, and share this episode with someone who loves real human stories from history. Evening approaches over Hacksaw Ridge with the weight of exhaustion that marks the end of impossible days. Nakamura watches Doss complete his 16th rescue, lowering a wounded radio man who had been trapped in a collapsed communication bunker since dawn. The rope groans audibly under the load, hemp fibers popping with sharp reports that echo off the limestone cliff face like small-caliber gunshots. Captain Morrison stands at the aid station entrance, after-action report clipboard in hand, trying to translate the day's events into language that regimental headquarters will find comprehensible. The mathematics prove stubborn. 1 unarmed medic, 18 wounded soldiers, successful evacuation of 16 men from positions that tactical doctrine classified as irrecoverable. The numbers resist easy explanation, especially when Morrison attempts to describe how those rescues were accomplished. Dr. Chen works on the radio man's wounds by lantern light, her movements efficient despite the fatigue that marks everyone who has spent 12 hours receiving wounded men from above. The soldier remains conscious enough to provide testimony that matches earlier reports. Doss moving through spaces where enemy fire created kill zones, crawling between crater holes with nothing but medical supplies, and whatever conviction sustains men who refuse to abandon wounded comrades. Saw him bandaging Japanese wounded too, the radio man reports weekly. 3 enemy soldiers in a shell hole, hurt bad from our artillery. He spent 20 minutes working on them before coming to get me. The detail adds another layer to actions that already strain credibility. Nakamura has observed Doss's approach to wounded enemy soldiers throughout their weeks on the ridge, watching the medic apply the same careful treatment to Japanese casualties that he provides American wounded. Such behavior violates every survival instinct trained into infantry soldiers. Yet it springs from convictions that recognize no uniform distinctions among bleeding men. Morrison checks his watch, calculating hours against orders that have grown more urgent with each delayed report to regimental command. 2 wounded Americans remain on the plateau above, their voices occasionally audible through the evening rain when wind conditions allow sound to carry clearly. Division expects casualty assessments, position reports, confirmation that units are moving according to operational timelines designed far from the reality of individual men who refuse to be abandoned. The rope hangs against the cliff face like a timeline measuring endurance in hemp fibers stretched beyond reasonable limits. Nakamura can see individual strands beginning to separate where the rope passes over coral edges, can count places where blood from wounded men has soaked into hemp until the entire line appears dark with moisture that contains more than rainwater. Doss sits beside the rope's anchor point, checking his remaining medical supplies by touch in the gathering darkness. His pack has been emptied and refilled multiple times during the day's rescues, restocked with bandages and morphine from the aid station's dwindling reserves. Yet his hands move with the same methodical precision that has marked every previous preparation, testing equipment that must function perfectly when lives depend on knots tied in darkness under enemy fire. 2 more, he says quietly, more to himself than anyone else. Johnson and Williams, both called out during the last trip up, Doctor. Chen looks up from her patient, studying the medic's face in the lantern light. 16 rescues have carved lines of exhaustion around his eyes, yet something deeper sustains him, a conviction that seems to draw strength from repetition rather than diminishing under accumulated strain. That rope's not going to last much longer, she observes, professional concern mixing with genuine admiration for what they have all witnessed. Hemp fibers have breaking points measured in both weight and repetitive stress. Doss runs the rope through his hands one more time, feeling for weak spots that could fail during the critical moments when wounded men depend entirely on hemp strands for survival. The examination reveals what everyone already knows: equipment stretched beyond design limitations, held together by prayer and stubborn refusal to accept the mathematics of material failure. "It'll hold," he says with quiet certainty. Long enough for 2 more. Nakamura understands now why the medic's hands tremble slightly as he prepares for another ascent. The tremor comes not from fear, but from the accumulated weight of responsibility that no training manual adequately prepared him for. Each wounded soldier becomes a promise that must be honored in rope burns and exhaustion, in prayers whispered during climbs up limestone faces slick with rain and darker moisture. Morrison approaches with news from the radio, his expression carrying the conflict between military necessity and human reality. Regiments ordered general withdrawal to secondary positions. All units to be moving within 2 hours. The order creates an impossible equation: military efficiency versus the lives of 2 wounded Americans who trusted their medic to return for them. Nakamura watches Doss absorb this information, sees the medic's jaw tighten almost imperceptibly before he moves toward the rope with the same methodical calm that has marked every previous ascent. "Tell Regiment the 307th Medical Detachment is still engaged," Doss says quietly. 2 more patients to evacuate. Darkness settles over Hacksaw Ridge with the finality of decisions that cannot be undone. Nakamura crouches beside the rope's anchor point, watching hemp fibers stretch and pop under loads that exceed every engineering specification for equipment in such condition. Above, Doss works in whispered conversation with the last 2 wounded soldiers, Johnson from Pittsburgh and Williams with the baby pictures, men whose voices have grown weaker throughout the day's long wait. Captain Morrison stands 20 feet back from the cliff edge, radio handset pressed against his ear as he argues with regimental command about timeline compliance and casualty evacuation procedures. The conversation carries poorly through static interference, but its essential tension comes through clearly: orders versus conscience, operational efficiency versus the stubborn mathematics of 2 lives that refuse to be reduced to acceptable losses. Doctor Chen monitors the medical supplies loaded in Doss's pack, calculating morphine and bandages against wounds that may require treatment beyond their remaining resources. Johnson's condition, based on his voice patterns heard from above, suggests internal bleeding that will need immediate surgery once he reaches the aid station. Williams has been unconscious for periods that indicate potential head trauma requiring careful transport to prevent further injury. Ropes showing separation at 3 major stress points, Nakamura reports, running his fingers along hemp sections where individual strands have begun parting under repetitive loading. Especially where it passes over that coral outcropping about halfway down. The technical assessment carries implications that everyone understands, but no one wants to articulate. 17 successful rescues have pushed equipment beyond reasonable limits, creating conditions where material failure becomes not just possible, but mathematically probable. Yet alternatives remain unthinkable. Abandoning wounded soldiers violates convictions that run deeper than tactical doctrine or engineering specifications. Doss pauses in his preparation, studying Nakamura's face in the dim light of shielded lanterns. The medic's exhaustion shows in details that accumulate over impossible days: rope burns across both palms, mud and cordite stains on his uniform, the slight tremor in his hands that comes from 12 hours of climbing and lowering loads that would challenge fresh soldiers using proper equipment. "Tommy," he says quietly, using the familiar name that has marked their evolving relationship. "If that rope fails during the descent, you'll need to rig a new line fast. Can't leave those boys hanging." The instruction reveals what Doss has known throughout the day's rescues, but never directly acknowledged: that hemp fibers have breaking points, measured not just in weight, but in accumulated stress applied over 17 trips, carrying impossible loads through conditions that would challenge equipment designed for such work. Each subsequent rescue increases the probability of catastrophic failure during moments when wounded men depend entirely on hemp strands for survival. Morrison ends his radio conversation with the frustrated acceptance of a man caught between irreconcilable orders. Regiment demands withdrawal confirmation within 30 minutes, yet 2 American soldiers remain trapped on positions that tactical doctrine has already written off as unrecoverable. The mathematics of military efficiency collide with the reality of voices calling medic through darkness that makes precision rescue work a matter of prayer and touch. "Weather's deteriorating," Morrison reports. "Storm front moving in from the Pacific. Rain's gonna make that rope slick as ice." Doss adjusts his helmet and checks his medical pack one final time, hands moving with practiced efficiency despite the exhaustion that marks everyone who has spent 18 hours under the strain of impossible expectations. His preparation carries the same methodical precision that has characterized every previous ascent, yet something different marks this moment, a quality of finality that suggests even stubborn faith recognizes the limits of hemp and human endurance. The secret that Doss has carried throughout 17 rescues reveals itself in the slight pause before he grips the rope for his final ascent. What the after-action reports will never record, what the citations and commendations cannot capture, is the moment of pure terror that grips him before each climb. The certain knowledge that statistical probability favors rope failure during the next descent, that physics makes no allowance for moral conviction or wounded soldiers who depend on equipment stretched beyond its breaking point. Yet he climbs anyway, not because fear disappears, but because the voices above matter more than the mathematical certainty of his own death. Johnson from Pittsburgh calling weakly for help. Williams, unconscious but breathing, trusting that promises made in Georgia training camps will be honored on coral cliffs in the Pacific. The rope bears his weight one more time, hemp fibers groaning under load, while Nakamura watches individual strands separate where limestone edges cut like broken glass. What the legend will never convey is the prayer Doss whispers during that final ascent, not for his own survival, but for sufficient time to lower 2 more wounded soldiers before the rope fails completely. The mathematics of material stress care nothing for moral conviction, yet something sustains hemp beyond its breaking point, long enough for one exhausted medic to honor promises that no tactical manual would classify as reasonable. 10 years after Hacksaw Ridge, Desmond Doss sits in his small Virginia home, turning a piece of frayed rope in weathered hands that still bear the scars of that impossible night. Rain drums against his windows with the same rhythm that marked Okinawan storms, bringing back the weight of 18 rescues that transformed hemp and human endurance into something approaching the miraculous. The rope fragment, carefully preserved from that final descent, serves as a tactile memory of decisions made in darkness when moral conviction outweighed material probability. Nakamura had saved the piece when the rope finally parted during Doss's 19th trip down the cliff face. By then, both Johnson and Williams lay safe in the aid station below, their wounds treated and transport arranged to rear area hospitals where proper surgery could address trauma that field medicine could only stabilize. The hemp had held exactly long enough, failing only after its purpose was fulfilled with mathematical precision that suggested intervention beyond mere physics. Captain Morrison's after-action report, filed 3 days later from a field desk in a rear cantonment area, condensed 18 rescues into clean military language that mentioned exceptional devotion to duty and disregard for personal safety. The citation supporting Doss's Medal of Honor contained similar phrases, each word carefully chosen to convey official recognition while avoiding the theological implications of rope that defied engineering specifications for exactly as long as wounded soldiers required evacuation. Dr. Chen had written her own medical assessment, documenting 17 successful trauma treatments performed under conditions that challenged every assumption about battlefield medicine. Her report noted the innovative use of improvised equipment, the remarkable success rate of patients evacuated from positions previously classified as irrecoverable, and the psychological impact on other medical personnel who witnessed actions that redefined their understanding of possible. Yet none of these official documents captured what Doss remembers most clearly from that night: the sound of hemp fibers popping under stress, the whispered prayers that accompanied each ascent, the moment when Williams regained consciousness during descent and asked if he was going home. The weight of 18 men, lowered safely, contrasts with the lightness of citations and commendations that reduced terror and exhaustion to phrases suitable for ceremonial reading. Nakamura visits occasionally, His own memories of Hacksaw Ridge filtered through decades that have softened the sharp edges of fear without diminishing the essential wonder of what they witnessed. Their conversations rarely address the rescue details directly. Both men understand that some experiences resist verbal explanation, that the full weight of that night remains locked in physical memory of rope burns and rain-soaked uniforms. The Japanese soldiers whom Doss treated during his final trip up the ridge, 3 wounded enemy combatants found in a shell crater near Johnson's position, survived their injuries and eventually returned to Japan. None ever learned the name of the American medic who spent precious minutes treating their wounds before continuing to his own wounded comrades. Yet their survival adds another layer to actions that complicated every assumption about warfare and enemy relationships. Morrison retired as a colonel, his later career marked by advocacy for combat medics and medical personnel who serve in forward positions under impossible conditions. His speeches at military medical schools often reference the statistical improbability of Doss's rescues, using mathematical models to demonstrate how hemp rope under such stress should have failed multiple times throughout that 18-hour period. The rope fragment in Doss's hands represents more than preserved hemp. It serves as physical testimony to the moment when material limitations yielded to moral necessity, when equipment held together through prayer and stubborn determination long enough for promises to be honored. The scars on his palms match frayed sections in the rope, creating a tactile record of decisions made when retreat represented abandonment and advance meant probable death. Williams, now a grandfather in Oregon, sends Christmas cards each year with photographs of children who exist because one medic refused to calculate rescue probability according to tactical doctrine. Johnson returned to Pittsburgh and a steel mill job. His chest wound healed, but his memory of being lowered down a cliff face in darkness remaining vivid enough to surface during thunderstorms that sound too much like artillery. The medical techniques Doss improvised on Hacksaw Ridge, using belt buckles as improvised pulleys, creating stretchers from salvaged equipment, developing knot configurations that distributed weight more efficiently, became standard training material for combat medics in subsequent conflicts. Yet the training manuals cannot transmit the essential element that made those techniques effective: the conviction that wounded soldiers deserve rescue attempts regardless of tactical probability. Doss sets the rope fragment aside and moves to his kitchen, where coffee waits in a pot that has replaced the mess kit cups of wartime. The simple domestic routine contrasts with memories of sharing water rations with wounded men who begged for moisture during long waits in shell holes. Yet both experiences share the basic human need for comfort in circumstances that test endurance beyond reasonable limits. Outside his window, Virginia rain continues its steady percussion, carrying no threat of sniper fire or mortar rounds. Yet the sound brings back the weight of 18 ascents, 18 descents, 18 wounded soldiers who trusted hemp and prayer more than engineering specifications. The rope held because it had to hold, failing only when its purpose was complete, and safety achieved for men whose lives depended on equipment stretched beyond every reasonable breaking point. If this story reminded you that behind every medal there's a human being carrying memories we'll never fully see, subscribe to the channel, tell us which country you watch from, and invite someone to revisit history with us in the next story.